The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, echoing through the mahogany-paneled courtroom as Judge Henderson's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Mrs. Patterson, based on the evidence presented today, I'm ordering full financial disclosure from your husband within 48 hours. The words should have felt like victory, but instead, they felt like the first crack in a dam that was about to burst and flood my entire world with truths I'd never wanted to discover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, I'd sat across from Marcus in our sun-drenched breakfast nook, watching him scroll through his phone while his coffee grew cold, and suggested what I thought was a reasonable solution to the growing distance between us. Maybe we should try counseling, I'd said, my voice carrying the hopeful tone of someone who still believed that 15 years of marriage could be salvaged with professional guidance and mutual effort. Marcus hadn't even looked up from his screen when he delivered the response that would eventually change everything. Marriage counseling is pointless, Rebecca. We're adults. If we can't figure out our own problems, paying some stranger to listen to us complain isn't going to magically fix anything. His dismissive tone had stung more than the words themselves, carrying an undertone that suggested our marital problems were somehow my fault for not being able to resolve them independently. That conversation had taken place on a Tuesday morning in February, with snow falling outside our Denver suburban home and the smell of the vanilla candles I'd lit to create a cozy atmosphere for what I'd hoped would be a productive discussion about our future. Instead, it had marked the beginning of the end of everything I'd believed about my marriage, my husband, and the life we'd built together. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way Marcus had become increasingly secretive about his work at Patterson Financial Consulting, the firm he'd built from nothing into one of Denver's most successful wealth management companies. The late nights that had evolved from occasional work demands into a regular pattern that left me eating dinner alone most evenings. The business trips that had grown longer and more frequent, taking him to cities where I'd suggested joining him only to be told that I'd be bored sitting in hotel rooms while he attended meetings with potential clients. Most tellingly, there had been the gradual erosion of intimacy between us. Not just physical intimacy, though that had certainly diminished, but the emotional connection that had once made us partners in everything from financial decisions to weekend plans. Marcus had begun making choices unilaterally, explaining them after the fact rather than including me in the decision-making process. When I'd questioned this shift in our dynamic, he'd attributed it to the stress of growing his business, and promised that things would return to normal once he'd secured a few major clients he'd been pursuing. But normal never came. Instead, Marcus had become increasingly critical of aspects of our life together that had never bothered him before. Our house was too traditional for his evolving taste. My career as a freelance graphic designer wasn't ambitious enough to match his professional trajectory. My social circle was too limited, lacking the kind of influential connections that could benefit his business expansion. Each criticism had been delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd grown tired of pretending to be satisfied with his current circumstances. I'd responded to Marcus's growing dissatisfaction by trying harder to become the woman he seemed to want. I'd researched interior designers to modernize our home's aesthetic. I'd attended networking events for creative professionals, hoping to expand my client base and increase my income. I'd even considered returning to the corporate design job I'd left years earlier to support Marcus's entrepreneurial ambitions, thinking that a more traditional career might earn his respect. None of it had worked. If anything, my efforts to adapt to Marcus's changing expectations had seemed to irritate him further, as if my willingness to change proved that I'd been inadequate before. The harder I tried to save our marriage, the more distant he became, until we were living like polite strangers, sharing a house, rather than partners sharing a life. The breaking point had come during what should have been a celebration. Marcus's firm had just secured the Patterson Industries account, a family business worth hundreds of millions that represented the kind of client he'd been pursuing for years. Instead of sharing his success with me, Marcus had announced that he'd be working late to finalize the details and wouldn't be home for dinner. Again, that night, as I'd sat alone at our dining room table with a carefully prepared meal growing cold, I'd made the decision that would ultimately save my life, though I didn't understand it at the time. I was done trying to save a marriage that Marcus clearly had no interest in preserving. If he found our relationship so unsatisfying that he couldn't even share his professional triumphs with me, then perhaps it was time to officially acknowledge what had already become true in practice. The next morning, I'd called Janet Morrison, the divorce attorney who'd handled my friend Sarah's complicated separation 3 years earlier. Janet had a reputation for being thorough, aggressive when necessary, and absolutely committed to protecting her clients' interests in high-asset divorces. If I was going to end my marriage, I wanted to do it right, with legal protection and a fair settlement that reflected my contributions to Marcus's success. Our initial consultation had been scheduled for the following Thursday, giving me a week to gather financial documents and prepare for what I assumed would be a straightforward discussion about asset division and support arrangements. Marcus and I had always maintained joint accounts, shared credit cards, and coordinated financial planning. I'd signed tax returns and legal documents without suspicion, trusting that the man I'd married would never deliberately mislead me about our shared finances. How naive that trust would prove to be. Janet's office occupied an entire floor of a downtown Denver high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Rocky Mountains that should have been inspiring, but instead felt intimidating. The conference room where we met was designed to project authority and success, with leather chairs arranged around a polished table that reflected the city lights like a dark mirror. I want you to understand that divorce proceedings can reveal information about marriages that spouses often prefer to keep private, Janet had warned me as we began reviewing my financial documents. People frequently discover that their partners have been less than honest about income, assets, or debts. Are you prepared for the possibility that Marcus might have financial secrets you're not aware of? I'd assured her that Marcus and I had always been transparent about money, that our financial partnership was one of the strongest aspects of our relationship even as other elements had deteriorated. Janet's expression had suggested she'd heard similar assurances from countless clients who'd later discovered the truth about their marriages through the brutal honesty of legal discovery processes. The first red flag had emerged within 24 hours of filing the divorce papers. Marcus's reaction to being served had been far more intense than I'd anticipated. Instead of the resigned acceptance I'd expected from someone who'd been emotionally checked out of our marriage for months, Marcus had displayed a level of panic that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Rebecca, we need to talk," he'd said when he'd called me that evening, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard in years. "This divorce filing is a mistake. We can work this out without involving lawyers and courts. There are things about our financial situation that are more complicated than you realize." More complicated than I realized. The phrase had echoed in my mind as I'd listened to Marcus explain why divorce would be disastrous for both of us, why we needed to resolve our differences privately, why involving the legal system would only create unnecessary expense and conflict. His arguments had been passionate, persuasive, and completely unlike the dismissive man who'd told me marriage counseling was pointless just weeks earlier. But I'd already committed to the legal process, and Janet had advised me that Marcus's sudden interest in reconciliation was likely motivated by concerns about financial disclosure, rather than genuine desire to repair our relationship. Men who've been hiding assets often become very interested in avoiding court-ordered discovery, she'd explained. His panic is probably proportional to what he's been concealing. The discovery process had begun immediately, with both sides requesting comprehensive financial documentation going back 5 years. Bank statements, tax returns, business records, investment accounts, credit card statements, loan applications, insurance policies, and any other documents that might reveal the true scope of our marital assets and debts. I had assumed this would be routine paperwork review, confirming what I already knew about our financial situation and establishing fair division of assets we'd accumulated together. Marcus had always handled most of our business finances while I'd managed household expenses and my freelance income, a division of labor that had seemed practical given his expertise in financial management and my preference for creative work over numbers. But the documents Marcus's attorney provided in response to our discovery requests had revealed discrepancies that made Janet's eyebrows rise, with the sharp attention of a predator detecting vulnerable prey. According to the financial statements Marcus had submitted, our joint savings account contained approximately $60,000, which matched my understanding of our household finances. However, the business records for Patterson Financial Consulting showed revenue and profit margins that should have generated significantly more wealth than what appeared in our personal accounts. "Where's the money going?" I'd asked Janet as we'd reviewed the initial submission, pointing to the obvious gap between Marcus's business success and our modest personal assets. "That's exactly what we're going to find out," Janet had replied, with the satisfied tone of an attorney who'd identified the weakness in an opponent's position. "Your husband's financial disclosure is incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. We're going to request detailed records for every account, every investment, every business transaction for the past 5 years." The court hearing that had produced Judge Henderson's order for full financial disclosure had been scheduled for a routine Tuesday morning in March. I'd expected a brief procedural meeting where both attorneys would present their initial positions and establish timelines for asset division. Instead, it had become the first public airing of Marcus's systematic deception, and the beginning of my education about the man I'd been married to for 15 years. Janet had come prepared with evidence that Marcus's initial financial disclosure had been grossly inadequate. Bank records she'd obtained through subpoenas showed wire transfers to accounts that hadn't been listed in his asset declaration, business partnerships that hadn't been mentioned in his corporate filings, investment properties purchased through shell companies that Marcus apparently controlled but had never disclosed to me. "Your Honor," Janet had argued with the cold precision of a surgeon dissecting a lie, "Mr. Patterson has attempted to conceal substantial assets through a complex network of business entities and offshore accounts. His initial disclosure represents perhaps 10% of the true marital estate, and we request immediate court intervention to prevent further asset concealment." Marcus's attorney, Robert Kim, had responded with the kind of technical objections that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation. "The business structures Mr. Patterson utilizes are standard practices for protecting client assets and ensuring compliance with financial regulations. Any suggestion that he's concealing marital property is speculation based on incomplete understanding of complex business operations." But Judge Henderson had years of experience with high-asset divorces and the creative methods wealthy spouses use to hide money from their partners. "The court finds sufficient evidence of potential asset concealment to warrant comprehensive disclosure," she'd ruled. "Mr. Patterson will provide complete documentation for all financial accounts, business entities, and investment vehicles under his control or influence within 48 hours. The moment that gavel had come down, I'd seen something shift in Marcus's expression. Not just frustration at an unfavorable ruling, but genuine fear of what complete financial disclosure might reveal. It was the look of a man who'd been caught in a lie so extensive that the truth might destroy everything he'd built. During the brief recess that followed Judge Henderson's order, I'd watched Marcus huddle with his attorney in urgent whispered conversation, their body language suggesting crisis management rather than routine legal strategy. Whatever secrets Marcus had been protecting were apparently significant enough to warrant emergency consultation about damage control. Rebecca, Marcus had approached me during the break, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation that I'd never seen before. "You're making a huge mistake pushing this financial discovery. There are business arrangements that could be damaged by court scrutiny, partnerships that require discretion. You could destroy everything I've built. Everything you've built," I'd replied, noting the singular pronoun. "What about everything we've built together?" "That's not what I meant," Marcus had backtracked quickly. But the slip had been revealing. In his mind, his financial success was his alone, despite the 15 years I'd spent supporting his career development, managing our household while he traveled, and sacrificing my own professional opportunities to provide stability for his entrepreneurial ventures. The 48-hour deadline for Marcus's financial disclosure had passed, with his attorney requesting an extension and Judge Henderson denying it, with the sharp impatience of someone who'd seen too many delay tactics in similar cases. "Mr. Patterson will comply with the court's order today or face sanctions for contempt," she'd declared when we'd reconvened on Thursday morning. What Marcus's complete financial disclosure revealed had been staggering in scope and devastating in its implications for everything I'd believed about our marriage. Instead of the moderately successful financial consulting firm I'd thought Marcus operated, Patterson Financial Consulting was apparently a multi-million-dollar operation with clients throughout the western United States and investment partnerships that generated income I'd never known existed. More disturbing than the hidden wealth were the methods Marcus had used to conceal it from me. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland that he'd established without my knowledge. real estate investments made through shell companies that listed him as the sole beneficial owner, stock portfolios and bond investments that should have been considered marital property but had been structured to appear as business assets beyond my legal reach. The total value of Marcus's hidden assets exceeded $4 million. Money that had been generated during our marriage through a business I'd helped him build, but had been systematically concealed from me through financial structures so complex they required forensic accounting to unravel. I'd been living in modest comfort while my husband had been accumulating wealth that could have supported luxury beyond my imagination, but the financial deception was only the beginning. As Janet's team of investigators had dug deeper into Marcus's business operations, they'd uncovered evidence of activities that were far more serious than marital asset concealment. Patterson Financial Consulting had been operating investment schemes that appeared legitimate on the surface, but were actually sophisticated fraud operations designed to separate wealthy clients from their money while protecting Marcus from legal liability. The discovery process had revealed email correspondence between Marcus and several business associates discussing strategies for maximizing client investments in ventures that Marcus privately acknowledged were likely to fail. Insurance policies that would benefit Marcus's company when client investments inevitably collapsed. Most damning had been recorded phone conversations where Marcus had laughed about elderly clients who trusted him with their retirement savings, referring to them as easy marks, who were too trusting to question his recommendations. "Your husband isn't just hiding assets from you," Janet had explained as we'd reviewed the mounting evidence of Marcus's criminal activities. "He's been operating a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that's defrauded clients of millions of dollars. This isn't just a divorce case anymore. We're looking at potential federal crimes that could result in decades in prison." The revelation that Marcus was a criminal had forced me to reconsider every aspect of our relationship through a new lens. Had he married me as cover for his illegal activities, using our stable domestic life to project the trustworthy image that made clients comfortable investing their life savings with him? How many elderly couples had lost their retirement security because they'd trusted the man who came home to dinner with me every night and complained about having to work late? Most personally devastating was the discovery of Marcus's relationship with his business partner, Victoria Chen, a relationship that the evidence suggested had been romantic as well as professional for at least 3 years. Email exchanges between Marcus and Victoria had revealed not just intimate personal communications, but detailed discussions about their shared future, once Marcus could extricate himself from his marriage without financial penalty. "The divorce will be expensive, but manageable if Rebecca doesn't discover the full scope of our operations," Marcus had written in one email that Janet's investigators had recovered. "She's never paid attention to the business details, so as long as we can keep the offshore accounts out of discovery, we should be able to preserve most of our assets for the next phase." The next phase. Reading those words had felt like discovering that my entire marriage had been a temporary arrangement in Marcus's mind, a placeholder situation that he'd always intended to abandon once his financial position was secure enough to support the life he actually wanted with the woman he actually loved. But perhaps the most chilling discovery had been Marcus's detailed planning for what he'd called my post-divorce adjustment period. Email exchanges with Victoria had revealed discussions about ensuring that I would be financially dependent after our separation, unable to afford legal challenges to their property division or investigations into their business operations. "Rebecca's always been too trusting and financially naive to cause problems," Marcus had written to Victoria with casual contempt that made my hands shake as I'd read it. "As long as we give her enough to maintain her current lifestyle, she'll accept the settlement and disappear into whatever small life she builds for herself. She's never been ambitious enough to fight for more than she thinks she deserves. Too trusting. Financially naive. Not ambitious enough to fight." Marcus's assessment of my character had been both insulting and strategically calculated. He'd been counting on my passivity, my desire to avoid conflict, my willingness to accept his explanations rather than demand proof. In his mind, I was a convenient wife who would become a convenient ex-wife, grateful for whatever modest settlement he chose to offer, and too intimidated by the legal process to demand more. Marcus had fundamentally underestimated the woman he'd married. While I'd never been interested in his business operations, I'd spent 15 years observing his methods, learning his patterns, understanding how his mind worked. I'd seen him manipulate business associates, clients, and even family members through charm, selective truth-telling, and carefully crafted emotional appeals. I'd simply never imagined that I was also being manipulated using the same techniques. But once I'd understood the scope of Marcus's deception, I'd also recognized that he'd inadvertently provided me with tools to fight back. 15 years of marriage had given me intimate knowledge of his weaknesses, his fears, his professional networks, and his psychological vulnerabilities. I knew which business relationships were genuine partnerships and which were opportunistic alliances. I understood his financial priorities and risk tolerance. Most importantly, I knew Victoria Chen. Or at least I'd observed enough of their professional interactions to understand her role in Marcus's operations. The decision to fight rather than accept Marcus's version of a fair settlement had crystallized during a conversation with my sister Amanda, who'd flown in from Portland to provide emotional support during what she'd assumed would be a routine divorce proceeding. Amanda was 5 years younger than me, but had always been more suspicious of Marcus than I'd been, questioning his explanations for various business decisions and expressing concern about my financial dependence on his success. "Rebecca, you supported Marcus through the early years when his business was failing," Amanda had reminded me as we'd sat in my kitchen reviewing Janet's latest discoveries. "You worked 2 jobs to pay for his professional development courses. You used your inheritance from mom and dad to fund his initial business startup. You've been his partner in building everything he has, even if he's structured the ownership to exclude you legally." My inheritance from our parents. I'd completely forgotten about the $40,000 I'd contributed to Marcus's business launch 8 years earlier, money that had come from the sale of our childhood home after our father's death. Marcus had promised to reimburse me once the business became profitable, but he'd later suggested that since we were married, the distinction between his assets and mine was meaningless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What mattered was our combined success as a team. Except that Marcus hadn't treated our assets as combined when he'd established his offshore accounts and shell companies. He'd been very careful to ensure that his wealth accumulation remained legally separate from our marital property, while simultaneously using my financial contributions and domestic support to build the foundation for his success. I'd been a partner when he needed my resources, but excluded when it was time to share the benefits. That realization had transformed my approach to the divorce proceedings. Instead of seeking a reasonable settlement that would allow me to start over modestly, I decided to fight for the full value of my contributions to Marcus's empire. Not just the direct financial investments I'd made, but compensation for the career opportunities I'd sacrificed, the business development support I'd provided, and the domestic stability that had allowed Marcus to travel extensively and take professional risks. Janet had been delighted by my change in strategy. High-asset divorces are won by clients who are willing to fight for what they're actually worth rather than what they think they deserve, she'd explained. Marcus has been counting on your willingness to accept less than full value for your contributions. We're going to disappoint him. The discovery process had expanded to include forensic accounting, business valuation, and investigation into Marcus's professional relationships with both clients and partners. What we'd uncovered had been a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that extended far beyond concealing assets from me. Marcus had been operating what amounted to a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, using client funds for unauthorized investments while reporting fictional returns that made his management performance appear exceptional. But our most valuable evidence had come from an unexpected source. Victoria Chen, apparently concerned about her own legal exposure as Marcus's crimes became increasingly difficult to conceal, had been documenting their conversations and business transactions for months. When Janet's investigators had approached Victoria's former assistant with questions about the business operations, they'd discovered that Victoria had been maintaining detailed records of Marcus's activities, apparently as insurance against potential prosecution. Marcus has no idea how much Victoria documented, Janet had reported after meeting with Victoria's assistant. Financial records, client communications, recorded phone calls discussing illegal activities. Victoria was apparently preparing to testify against Marcus if necessary to protect herself from criminal charges. The betrayal within the betrayal had been almost entertaining in its poetic justice. Marcus had been planning to abandon me for Victoria, while Victoria had been planning to abandon Marcus to federal prosecutors. Neither of them had been honest with the other about their ultimate intentions, creating a situation where their mutual deception would ultimately benefit me. Armed with Victoria's documentation of Marcus's criminal activities, Janet had been able to negotiate with federal prosecutors who'd been building their own case against Patterson Financial Consulting, based on client complaints and suspicious transaction patterns. In exchange for my cooperation as a witness against Marcus's fraud operations, the government had agreed to support my claims for restitution that would include not just my share of hidden marital assets, but compensation for my unwitting participation in presenting a legitimate facade for Marcus's criminal enterprise. Your marriage wasn't just a personal relationship, the federal prosecutor had explained during our strategy meeting. Marcus used your status as his wife to project stability and trustworthiness that made clients comfortable investing with him. You were an unwitting accomplice in his fraud scheme, which makes you entitled to victim compensation in addition to your divorce settlement. The irony hadn't been lost on me. Marcus's dismissal of marriage counseling as pointless had ultimately led to court proceedings that exposed not just his marital deceptions, but his entire criminal operation. If he'd been willing to work on our relationship through counseling, I might never have discovered the fraud that would ultimately send him to federal prison. The day Marcus was arrested had been a Tuesday in April, exactly 2 months after he'd told me that marriage counseling was pointless. Federal agents had arrived at Patterson Financial Consulting during a client meeting, placing Marcus in handcuffs while his elderly clients watched in horror as their trusted financial advisor was led away in custody. I'd been at home when Janet had called with the news, working on a graphic design project for a small nonprofit organization, trying to maintain some normalcy while the legal proceedings dismantled my entire life. Marcus is in federal custody, she'd said, without preamble. The charges include mail fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 20 to 30 years in prison. The house had felt different after Marcus's arrest, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the poison of his deception and were now exhaling truth into every room. I'd walked through the spaces we'd shared for 15 years, seeing them with new understanding of what our life together had actually been. The kitchen where I'd prepared dinner while Marcus worked late defrauding clients. The living room where we'd entertained friends while maintaining the facade of a successful, stable couple. The bedroom where we'd slept beside each other while Marcus planned my financial destruction and romantic replacement. But along with the devastation of learning that my marriage had been built on lies, I'd felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For months, I'd been trying to save a relationship that Marcus had never been emotionally invested in preserving. I'd been working to become the woman he wanted while he'd been systematically planning to replace me with someone else entirely. The failure of our marriage hadn't been my fault for not being interesting enough, successful enough, or supportive enough. It had been inevitable because Marcus had never intended it to be permanent. The divorce settlement, when it was finally reached 6 months later, had reflected not just the division of our legitimate marital assets, but restitution for my unwitting participation in Marcus's fraud scheme, and compensation for the career opportunities I'd sacrificed to support his criminal enterprise. Janet had negotiated aggressively, using the federal prosecution as leverage to secure a settlement that would provide me with financial security for the rest of my life. You'll receive approximately $2.8 million in total compensation, Janet had explained as we'd reviewed the final settlement agreement. Half represents your share of legitimate marital assets and half represents victim restitution from the federal case. Marcus will also be responsible for all legal fees and court costs. More satisfying than the financial settlement had been the knowledge that Marcus's criminal network was being systematically dismantled by federal investigators using the evidence we'd provided. Victoria Chen had indeed testified against Marcus in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming that their romantic relationship had been as calculated and temporary as his marriage to me. She described Marcus as a manipulative narcissist who'd used emotional connections to facilitate his criminal activities, viewing both his wife and his mistress as useful assets rather than genuine partners. The trial had been a media sensation in Denver, with financial reporters covering every revelation about Marcus's sophisticated fraud scheme and the wealthy clients who trusted him with their life savings. I'd attended every day of proceedings, watching from the gallery as witness after witness described how Marcus had convinced them to invest in ventures he'd known would fail, while secretly profiting from their losses. But the most powerful testimony had come from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an 83-year-old widow who'd lost her entire retirement savings to one of Marcus's fraudulent investment schemes, had taken the stand with the dignity of someone who'd survived far worse betrayals than financial theft. Mr. Patterson seemed so trustworthy, she'd said in a voice that carried clearly through the silent courtroom. He showed me pictures of his beautiful wife and their lovely home. He talked about building long-term relationships with clients, based on trust and mutual success. I believed him because he seemed like a man who understood the value of commitment and integrity. The irony had been devastating. Marcus had used our marriage, our home, our apparent stability as marketing tools to convince vulnerable clients that he was trustworthy enough to manage their life savings. Mrs. Walsh and dozens of other victims had lost their financial security, partly because they'd believed that a man with a stable 15-year marriage must be someone who honored his commitments. When the guilty verdict had been announced on all counts, I'd felt not satisfaction, but a profound sadness for all the lives Marcus had damaged through his systematic deception. The clients who'd lost their retirement security. Victoria Chen, whose career and reputation had been destroyed by her association with his crimes. Even Marcus himself, who'd traded a legitimate marriage and honest business success for a criminal empire that had ultimately cost him everything. The judge's sentencing had reflected the magnitude of Marcus's crimes and the number of victims he'd harmed. 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Financial restitution to all identified victims. Forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activities. Complete prohibition from any involvement in financial services upon his eventual release. As Marcus had been led away in shackles, he'd looked back at me one final time, his expression carrying a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. Not regret for his crimes or the harm he'd caused, I'd realized, but regret for underestimating the woman he'd dismissed as too trusting and financially naive to cause problems. The woman Marcus had married 15 years earlier might have accepted his version of events, trusted his explanations, and settled for whatever modest compensation he'd been willing to offer. But the woman sitting in that courtroom, armed with evidence of his systematic deception and supported by legal advocates who understood the true value of her contributions, was someone Marcus had never bothered to really know. In the end, Marcus had been right about one thing. Marriage counseling would have been pointless. Our relationship had been doomed from the moment he'd decided that I was a temporary convenience rather than a permanent partner. But divorce court had been extraordinarily productive, exposing not just his financial crimes, but the criminal network he'd been part of, and ensuring that both I and his other victims received the justice and compensation we deserved. The house I'd once shared with Marcus had been sold as part of the asset forfeiture process, with my portion of the proceeds adding to the settlement that would support my independent future. I'd moved to a smaller place in Boulder, closer to the mountains I'd always loved, but that Marcus had dismissed as an impractical distance from downtown business opportunities. My new life was quieter, simpler, and infinitely more honest than the one I'd shared with Marcus. I'd expanded my graphic design business, taking on projects with nonprofit organizations and small businesses that appreciated creative work over profit maximization. I'd reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the years when Marcus had criticized my social circle as insufficiently ambitious for his evolving status. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about people and situations, rather than deferring to someone else's supposedly superior knowledge. The red flags I'd dismissed in Marcus's behavior had been real warnings that I'd been trained to ignore through years of being told that my concerns were unfounded, or my perceptions were inaccurate. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I'd received a letter from Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the elderly widow, who'd testified so powerfully about the impact of his fraud. She'd written to thank me for having the courage to pursue the legal action that had exposed Marcus's crimes and secured restitution for his victims. If you hadn't been willing to fight for the truth, she'd written in her careful handwriting, people like me would never have gotten justice. Your strength gave all of us strength. I hope you know how much that means to the families he hurt. Reading Mrs. Walsh's letter, I'd understood that my divorce from Marcus had been about more than ending a failed marriage or securing my financial future. It had been about refusing to accept someone else's version of reality when that version involved lies, manipulation, and harm to innocent people. It had been about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is the person you'd planned to spend your life with. Marcus had been right about marriage counseling being pointless for us. Our problems hadn't been communication issues or mismatched expectations that could be resolved through guided conversation. Our problems had been that one of us was a criminal who'd been using our marriage as cover for fraud operations, while the other had been an honest partner trying to save a relationship that had never been real in the first place. But divorce court had been extraordinarily productive, revealing truths that changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone Marcus had deceived. Sometimes the end of a marriage isn't a failure of love or commitment. Sometimes it's the beginning of justice, the first step toward protecting yourself and others from someone who's been hiding behind the facade of domestic respectability while causing systematic harm. The gavel that had come down in Judge Henderson's courtroom hadn't just ended my marriage to Marcus. It had ended his ability to use the trust and vulnerability of others as weapons for his own enrichment. And in the process, it had taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be complicit in someone else's lies, even when those lies have been the foundation of everything you thought you knew about love. As I'd packed up the last of my belongings from the house Marcus and I had shared, I'd found a card he'd given me on our 10th wedding anniversary. Inside, he'd written, "To my partner in everything, thank you for making me a better man." At the time, I'd treasured those words as evidence of his love and appreciation. Now I understood them as perhaps the only honest thing Marcus had ever said to me. I had made him a better criminal by providing the domestic stability that made his fraud operations possible. But I'd also made him a more vulnerable one by being in a position to expose his crimes when I'd finally found the courage to seek the truth. In the end, our partnership had indeed made him a better man, just not in the way either of us had expected. The lesson I'd learned from my marriage to Marcus Patterson wasn't about the importance of financial literacy or the dangers of trusting too completely, though both of those were certainly relevant. The real lesson was about the difference between loyalty and complicity, between supporting someone's growth and enabling their destruction, between love that builds people up and attachment that allows them to tear others down. Marcus had counted on my loyalty to protect his secrets, my attachment to our marriage to prevent me from seeking truth, and my love for him to excuse his betrayal of that love. He'd been wrong about all of it. Real love demands honesty. Real partnership requires mutual respect. And real loyalty means refusing to be complicit in harm, even when that harm is being caused by someone you'd planned to love forever. In the quiet of my new home, surrounded by furniture I'd chosen without consideration for anyone else's taste and walls decorated with artwork that reflected my actual preferences rather than someone else's image management, I'd finally understood what Marcus had been too selfish to recognize. Marriage counseling might have been pointless for saving our relationship, but it could have saved him from himself if he'd been willing to honestly examine his behavior and motivations. Instead, he'd chosen to dismiss the possibility of growth and change, assuming that his problems could be solved through deception and manipulation, rather than honest communication and genuine effort. That choice had cost him his freedom, his wealth, his reputation, and ultimately his ability to hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me and his fraud victims. Divorce court had indeed been much more productive than marriage counseling could ever have been. It had produced justice, truth, financial security, and most importantly, the knowledge that I was strong enough to fight for myself and others when fighting was necessary. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is stop trying to save something that was never worth saving in the first place, and start building something new that's based on honesty rather than illusion. The morning sun streaming through my new kitchen windows fell across the newspaper article I'd saved from Marcus's sentencing, with its headline reading, "Local Financial Advisor Sentenced to 22 Years for Fraud Scheme." Below it was a smaller article about the Victim Restitution Fund that would help elderly clients recover their stolen retirement savings. Justice had been served, victims had been compensated, and a dangerous criminal had been prevented from causing further harm. Marriage counseling might have been pointless, but divorce court had been the most productive experience of my life. It had freed me from a criminal, exposed a fraud network, protected future victims, and taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to seek truth, even when that truth destroys everything you thought you knew about your life. Looking back, I wouldn't change a single thing about the path that had led me from Marcus's dismissive declaration about marriage counseling to the courtroom where his lies had finally been exposed. Sometimes the end of one story is really the beginning of another, better one. And sometimes the most important thing you can discover is that you're stronger, smarter, and more valuable than anyone who's been taking advantage of you ever wanted you to know. The investigation deepened 3 weeks after Judge Henderson's initial ruling, when Janet received a call that would transform our divorce case into something far more complex and dangerous than either of us had anticipated. Agent Sarah Torres from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division had been monitoring Marcus's business activities for months as part of a broader investigation into financial fraud networks operating throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Mrs. Patterson, Agent Torres had said during our first meeting in Janet's conference room, "Your husband's operations are part of a much larger criminal enterprise than we initially understood. We need your cooperation to expose the full scope of this network and protect other potential victims." Agent Torres was a compact woman in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made me understand why Marcus's sophisticated fraud schemes hadn't remained hidden from federal scrutiny. She'd been tracking suspicious patterns in investment losses and insurance claims across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, patterns that had eventually led her to Patterson Financial Consulting and the web of shell companies Marcus had created to conceal his criminal activities. "The evidence we've gathered suggests your husband has been working with at least 6 other financial advisors in a coordinated scheme to defraud wealthy clients," Agent Torres had explained, as she'd spread photographs and financial documents across Janet's conference table. They target elderly investors, recent widows, and people going through major life transitions who are vulnerable to promises of security and guaranteed returns. Looking at the photographs, I'd recognized several faces from social events Marcus and I had attended over the years. Business associates he'd introduced as colleagues in the financial services industry, people I'd assumed were legitimate professionals building their careers in wealth management. Instead, they'd been co-conspirators in a criminal network that had systematically stolen millions of dollars from vulnerable clients, while maintaining facades of respectability in their communities. Dr. Michael Reeves, the investment advisor who'd handled my parents' estate planning, was among the photographs. I'd trusted him with my inheritance, because Marcus had recommended him as someone who specialized in conservative strategies for preserving family wealth. Now I understood that Dr. Reeves had been funneling client funds into Marcus's fraudulent investment schemes while taking commissions on the inevitable losses that would follow. Agent Torres had been building her case for 8 months, but she'd lacked the inside access necessary to prove the coordination between the various fraud operations. My position as Marcus's wife, combined with my willingness to cooperate with federal investigators, provided the opportunity she'd needed to document the network's activities and gather evidence that would support prosecution of all involved parties. "We want you to help us record conversations with your husband," Agent Torres had said, her tone making it clear that this wasn't really a request. "Marcus is going to be desperate to control the narrative around your divorce proceedings. He'll try to convince you to accept a settlement that protects his assets and prevents further investigation into his business operations. We need documentation of those attempts to influence your testimony." The idea of secretly recording Marcus had been both terrifying and strangely empowering. For 15 years, I'd been the unwitting audience for his manipulation techniques, watching him charm clients, business associates, and even family members into making decisions that ultimately benefited him at their expense. Now I would be documenting those same techniques being used against me, creating evidence that would expose his methods to federal prosecutors and potential victims. Agent Torres had provided me with recording equipment that was virtually undetectable, devices designed to capture clear audio during seemingly casual conversations. She'd also assigned Agent David Kim to coordinate my safety and ensure that Marcus didn't become suspicious of my cooperation with federal investigators. Your husband is already under surveillance, Agent Kim had assured me during our initial security briefing. We have teams monitoring his movements, his communications, and his financial transactions. If he shows any signs of becoming violent or desperate, we'll intervene immediately. The possibility that Marcus might become violent hadn't occurred to me until Agent Kim had mentioned it. Throughout our marriage, Marcus had never been physically aggressive, preferring psychological manipulation to direct confrontation. But men facing federal prosecution for financial crimes sometimes acted unpredictably, especially when they realized their carefully constructed facades were collapsing. The first recorded conversation had taken place 4 days after my meeting with federal agents, when Marcus had called to request a private dinner at our house to discuss what he'd described as a reasonable settlement proposal that would benefit both of us. His tone had carried the familiar mixture of charm and subtle pressure that I'd learned to recognize as his standard approach to getting what he wanted from people. "Rebecca, I know this divorce process has been overwhelming," Marcus had said as we'd sat in our dining room with the recording device hidden in my jacket pocket capturing every word. "But we don't have to let lawyers and courts tear apart everything we've built together. We can reach an agreement that protects both our interests without destroying the business relationships I've spent years developing." The business relationships he'd spent years developing were criminal partnerships that had defrauded hundreds of elderly clients. But Marcus's phrasing had been carefully chosen to make his concerns sound reasonable, and his motivations seem protective rather than self-serving. He'd been using the same techniques on me that he'd used on Mrs. Walsh and countless other victims who'd trusted him with their financial security. "I want what's fair," I'd replied, following Agent Torres's instructions to encourage Marcus to be specific about his concerns regarding the divorce proceedings. "But I also want to understand why you've been hiding so much of our financial situation from me. Some of these accounts I've never heard of before." Marcus's expression had shifted subtly, his practiced smile becoming slightly strained as he'd realized I was asking more detailed questions than he'd expected. "Those accounts are business structures, Rebecca. Complex arrangements that are necessary for protecting client assets and ensuring compliance with federal regulations. They're not hidden, they're just organized in ways that wouldn't make sense to someone without extensive experience in financial management." The casual condescension in his explanation had been exactly what Agent Torres had predicted. Marcus had been counting on my supposed financial naivete to make his lies seem plausible, assuming that I would accept his technical explanations rather than demanding proof or seeking independent verification of his claims. "But some of these accounts are in the Cayman Islands," I'd pressed, watching his body language change as he'd realized I'd been paying more attention to the financial disclosure documents than he'd anticipated. "Why would client asset protection require offshore banking?" "That's exactly the kind of question that shows why we need to keep this settlement negotiation between us," Marcus had replied, his tone becoming slightly more urgent. "International financial structures are complicated, and if federal investigators start examining them without understanding their legitimate purposes, they could destroy perfectly legal business arrangements and hurt innocent clients who've trusted me with their investments." Innocent clients who'd trusted him. The irony had been overwhelming, knowing that Marcus's innocent clients were actually the victims of his systematic fraud, while he tried to position himself as their protector against government overreach. He'd been so committed to his lies that he'd apparently started believing them himself, or at least believing that he could make other people believe them. The conversation had continued for over an hour, with Marcus alternately appealing to my loyalty, my financial fears, and my concern for his business reputation. He'd offered me a settlement of $800,000, which he'd described as generous given our modest lifestyle and my limited financial contributions to his business success. $800,000 when the hidden assets Agent Torres had identified exceeded $4 million. Marcus had been offering me roughly 20% of what I was legally entitled to receive, while characterizing his offer as generous recognition of my value as his former wife. "I need time to think about your proposal," I'd said finally, knowing that Agent Torres wanted me to avoid committing to any specific response that might influence Marcus's future behavior. "This is a lot to process, and I want to make sure I'm making the right decision for both of us." Marcus's relief had been visible, as he'd interpreted my response as weakness rather than strategy. "Of course, take all the time you need," he'd said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with practiced tenderness. "I know this is difficult, but I'm confident we can work this out privately without involving more lawyers and investigators than necessary." After Marcus had left that evening, I'd met with Agent Torres to review the recording and plan our next steps. The conversation had provided exactly the kind of evidence federal prosecutors needed to demonstrate Marcus's attempts to obstruct their investigation by influencing potential witnesses. "He's offering you approximately 20% of your actual legal entitlement," Agent Torres had observed as we'd reviewed the financial calculations. "That level of deception indicates he's desperate to prevent complete asset disclosure, which suggests there are additional hidden accounts we haven't discovered yet." Additional hidden accounts. The possibility that Marcus's criminal activities were even more extensive than we'd understood had been both disturbing and oddly motivating. Every revelation about the scope of his deception made me more committed to ensuring that he faced full accountability for his actions and that his victims received complete restitution for their losses. The second recorded conversation had taken place a week later, when Marcus had become increasingly agitated about the pace of our settlement negotiations and the federal investigators who'd begun interviewing his business associates. This time, he'd suggested meeting at a restaurant downtown, apparently believing that a public location would make me more likely to agree to his terms. "Rebecca, we're running out of time to resolve this privately," Marcus had said, his charm replaced by barely concealed desperation. "Federal investigators are asking questions about business arrangements that they don't understand, and their involvement is going to destroy everything I've worked to build. Not just for me, but for our clients who depend on the services we provide. Our clients." Marcus was still using plural pronouns to suggest that I was somehow involved in his business decisions, when the reality was that he deliberately excluded me from any knowledge of his professional activities, while using our marriage as marketing material to convince victims that he was trustworthy. "What kind of questions are they asking?" I'd inquired, following Agent Torres's guidance to encourage Marcus to reveal more details about the investigation and his concerns about exposure. "They want records of all business transactions, investment strategies, client communications, partnership agreements," Marcus had said, listing exactly the kinds of evidence that would expose his fraud network to federal prosecution. "They're treating legitimate business practices like they're criminal activities, and they're going to destroy the reputations of everyone involved based on their misunderstanding of how sophisticated financial services actually work." The federal investigators weren't misunderstanding anything. They were precisely understanding Marcus's criminal activities and building cases that would hold him and his co-conspirators accountable for their systematic theft from vulnerable clients. But Marcus's framing of their investigation as government overreach had been designed to make me sympathetic to his position and concerned about the consequences of cooperation with law enforcement. "Maybe you should just provide them with whatever information they're requesting," I'd suggested innocently. "If your business practices are legitimate, wouldn't complete transparency be the best way to resolve their concerns and protect your reputation?" Marcus's reaction had been immediate and revealing. His face had flushed with anger, and his voice had carried an edge of panic that he'd tried unsuccessfully to control. "Rebecca, you don't understand how these investigations work. Federal agents aren't interested in truth or justice. They're interested in building cases that make them look successful, regardless of how many innocent people they destroy in the process. Complete transparency would just give them more material to misinterpret and use against us." Us. Again with the plural pronouns, as if I were somehow complicit in his criminal activities, rather than one of his victims. Marcus had been so committed to his manipulation techniques that he'd continued using them even when they were being recorded for potential use in his federal prosecution. The conversation had deteriorated from there, with Marcus becoming increasingly aggressive about the need for me to accept his settlement offer and cease cooperation with any investigations into his business activities. He'd implied that my continued involvement with federal agents would be harmful to both of us, and that I was being naive about the consequences of allowing government interference in our private affairs. By the end of our dinner, Marcus had essentially confessed to criminal activity while simultaneously threatening me to prevent my testimony against him. The recording would provide federal prosecutors with clear evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, charges that would significantly increase his potential prison sentence. Agent Torres had been pleased with the results of our second recorded conversation, but she'd also been concerned about Marcus's escalating desperation and the possibility that he might take more dramatic action to prevent my cooperation with federal investigators. We're accelerating our timeline for arresting the entire network, she'd explained during our debriefing session. Marcus is becoming unstable, and unstable criminals sometimes make decisions that put witnesses at risk. We want you in protective custody until we can safely execute arrest warrants for all involved parties. Protective custody had meant staying in a downtown hotel under federal surveillance, while Agent Torres's team finalized their cases against Marcus and his co-conspirators. The isolation had been difficult, but it had also provided me with time to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered about my marriage and my husband's true character. During those 3 days in protective custody, I'd received a call from Victoria Chen that had added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Victoria had apparently realized that Marcus was likely to implicate her in his criminal activities once he was arrested, and she'd decided to contact me directly to propose what she'd described as a mutually beneficial arrangement. "Rebecca, I know this situation is difficult for you," Victoria had said, her voice carrying the same manipulative charm that Marcus used when he wanted something from someone. "But Marcus has been lying to both of us about his activities and his intentions. I have information that could protect you legally and financially if you're willing to hear my perspective on what's really been happening." Agent Torres had been monitoring the call, and she'd signaled for me to continue the conversation while federal technicians recorded every word. The FBI was interested in anything Victoria might reveal about the fraud network's operations, and her apparent willingness to cooperate against Marcus suggested that their criminal partnership was fracturing under federal pressure. "What kind of information?" I'd asked, knowing that Agent Torres wanted me to encourage Victoria to be specific about her knowledge of Marcus's activities. "Marcus has been using our relationship to gain access to confidential client information from my firm," Victoria had explained, apparently unaware that she was confessing to securities fraud while trying to position herself as another of Marcus's victims. "He convinced me that we were building something together, but I've realized he was just using me to identify wealthy clients who could be targeted for fraudulent investment schemes." The revelation that Victoria had been providing Marcus with inside information about her firm's clients had been shocking in its implications. Marcus hadn't just been operating his own fraud schemes, he'd been using his romantic relationship with Victoria to gain access to confidential financial information that he could use to identify and target additional victims. Agent Torres had immediately recognized the significance of Victoria's admission. Securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, racketeering. She'd whispered to me during a brief pause in the conversation. Victoria just confessed to federal crimes that could result in decades in prison. She's going to be very motivated to cooperate with our investigation. The conversation with Victoria had continued for nearly an hour, during which she'd revealed details about the fraud network that even Agent Torres hadn't previously understood. Marcus had been coordinating with financial advisors at 7 different firms, using romantic relationships, business partnerships, and professional associations to gain access to client information and coordinate fraudulent investment schemes across multiple states. The network had been operating for at least 6 years, generating an estimated $15 million in fraudulent profits, while devastating hundreds of elderly investors who'd trusted their financial advisors with their life savings. The sophistication of their coordination had made their crimes difficult to detect, as losses were distributed across multiple firms and jurisdictions in ways that prevented clear patterns from emerging. But Victoria's cooperation with federal investigators would provide the missing evidence needed to prosecute the entire network and recover stolen assets for victim restitution. Her detailed knowledge of the coordination between firms, combined with her access to financial records and client communications, would fill the gaps in Agent Torres's case and ensure that all involved parties faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning in late April, while meeting with elderly clients who'd entrusted him with their retirement savings. Agent Torres had timed the arrest to maximize the psychological impact on Marcus, while ensuring that his victims understood that their trusted financial advisor had been systematically stealing from them. I'd watched the arrest from a federal surveillance vehicle parked across the street from Marcus's office building, seeing him led away in handcuffs, while his clients stood in shocked confusion outside the building they'd entered, expecting a routine investment review. The contrast between Marcus's professional appearance and his criminal reality had been stark, emphasizing how effectively he'd used the facade of respectability to facilitate his crimes. The arrest had been coordinated with simultaneous raids on the offices of Marcus's co-conspirators throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. By the end of the day, federal agents had arrested 12 individuals and seized financial records, computer equipment, and assets valued at over $20 million. The scope of the operation had been unprecedented in the region, exposing a criminal network that had operated successfully for years by exploiting the trust and vulnerability of elderly investors. Victoria Chen had been arrested at her Denver office 2 hours after Marcus, though her cooperation with federal investigators had already secured her a plea agreement that would significantly reduce her potential prison sentence in exchange for her testimony against the other network members. Her decision to betray Marcus had been motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, but it had provided federal prosecutors with evidence that would ensure comprehensive justice for all victims. Janet had called me immediately after the arrest to confirm that my cooperation with federal investigators had been successful and that my legal position in the divorce proceedings had been significantly strengthened by the criminal charges against Marcus. Marcus is facing federal charges that could result in life in prison, Janet had explained with satisfaction. His assets are being seized for victim restitution, his professional reputation is destroyed, and his ability to manipulate you or anyone else has been eliminated. You're not just getting divorced anymore, Rebecca. You're getting justice. The federal seizure of Marcus's assets had complicated our divorce proceedings but had ultimately benefited my financial position. Because I'd been classified as a victim of Marcus's fraud, rather than a beneficiary of his crimes, I was entitled to restitution payments that would exceed what I would have received through traditional asset division. The house, the business, the offshore accounts, the shell companies. Everything Marcus had built through criminal activity would be liquidated to compensate his victims, with my share reflecting both my status as his defrauded wife and my contributions to the facade of respectability that had made his crimes possible. The trial preparation had begun immediately, with federal prosecutors building cases against all 12 network members, while coordinating with victims across multiple states who would testify about the impact of the fraudulent investment schemes. Agent Torres had estimated that the combined trials would take over a year to complete, but the evidence was so comprehensive that plea agreements were likely for most defendants. Marcus, however, had refused to accept responsibility for his actions or cooperate with federal investigators. His attorney had announced plans to argue that Marcus had been operating legitimate investment strategies that had unfortunately resulted in client losses, and that federal prosecutors were criminalizing normal business practices in order to appease political pressure for high-profile convictions. The defense strategy had been doomed from the beginning, given the recorded conversations where Marcus had explicitly discussed defrauding clients, and the extensive financial evidence showing deliberate theft rather than investment losses. But Marcus's refusal to accept responsibility had meant that his case would proceed to trial, giving me the opportunity to testify against him and publicly describe the impact of his deception on both his clients and his family. Victoria's cooperation had been essential to building the federal case, but it had also revealed additional details about Marcus's character that had been difficult for me to process. According to her testimony, Marcus had described me as a convenient cover for his criminal activities, someone whose trusting nature and financial naivete made her perfect for projecting the stable domestic image that clients found reassuring. He said you were the ideal wife for someone in his position, Victoria had told federal prosecutors during one of her debriefing sessions that I'd been allowed to observe. Not too curious about business matters, not socially ambitious enough to ask uncomfortable questions, grateful for whatever lifestyle he provided without demanding detailed explanations about how he could afford it. The clinical way Marcus had assessed my usefulness as a wife had been devastating to hear, but it had also been liberating in its honesty. I'd spent months wondering if I could have done something differently to save our marriage, questioning whether my failure to be more interesting or ambitious had driven Marcus to seek fulfillment elsewhere. Victoria's testimony had made it clear that Marcus had specifically chosen me because I was trusting and deferential, qualities that had made me an ideal unwitting accomplice to his crimes rather than inadequate as a partner. The federal trial had begun in September, 8 months after Marcus's arrest, and nearly a year after I'd first suggested marriage counseling as a solution to our relationship problems. The Denver courtroom had been filled with elderly victims, family members, federal agents, and media representatives covering what had become the largest financial fraud prosecution in Colorado history. Marcus had entered the courtroom each day in a press suit, attempting to maintain the professional appearance that had been so crucial to his criminal success. But the contrast between his polished exterior and the evidence of his systematic theft from vulnerable clients had been stark, emphasizing the calculated nature of his deception and manipulation. The prosecution's case had been methodical and comprehensive, with Agent Torres and her team presenting financial records, recorded conversations, victim testimony, and expert analysis that had painted a clear picture of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Each day of testimony had revealed new details about the sophistication of the fraud network and the devastating impact on clients who trusted their financial advisors with their life savings. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh had been among the first victims to testify, describing how Marcus had convinced her to invest her late husband's insurance money in what he described as guaranteed safe investments that would preserve her financial security for the rest of her life. Instead, the investments had been fictitious schemes designed to transfer her money to Marcus's personal accounts while generating fictional returns that had delayed her discovery of the theft until her savings were completely depleted. "My husband saved that money for 40 years, Mrs. Walsh had said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He wanted me to be secure after he was gone. Mr. Patterson looked me in the eye and promised that his investments would honor my husband's wishes and protect our legacy. Instead, he stole everything we'd worked for and left me with nothing but lies." The impact of Mrs. Walsh's testimony had been profound, not just on the jury, but on the media representatives and family members who'd filled the courtroom gallery. Marcus had maintained his composure during most of the testimony, but I'd seen him flinch when Mrs. Walsh had described how his theft had forced her to sell her home and move in with her daughter because she could no longer afford independent living. Victoria's testimony had provided the detailed insider knowledge necessary to prove the coordination between network members and the deliberate nature of their fraud schemes. Her description of Marcus as a manipulative narcissist who'd used emotional relationships to facilitate criminal activities had been damaging not just to his legal defense, but to any remaining shred of his public reputation. He viewed people as assets to be exploited, Victoria had said during her cross-examination. Her voice steady, despite the obvious difficulty of testifying against someone she'd been romantically involved with. Clients were sources of money to be stolen, business associates were tools for accessing additional victims, and personal relationships were covers for criminal activity. Everything was calculated to benefit Marcus, regardless of the harm caused to other people. But the most powerful testimony had come from Dr. Patricia Williams, Marcus's accountant, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Dr. Williams had maintained detailed records of the network's financial transactions, apparently as insurance against potential prosecution, and her testimony had provided a comprehensive overview of how the fraud schemes had operated and how profits had been distributed among network members. The total amount stolen from clients exceeded $18 million, Dr. Williams had testified, consulting financial records that had been projected onto screens throughout the courtroom. The network members had kept approximately 60% of the stolen funds, with the remainder being used to pay fictional returns to existing clients in order to delay discovery of the theft and maintain the facade of successful investment management. $18 million stolen from elderly clients who'd trusted their financial advisors with their life savings. The magnitude of the theft had been staggering, representing not just financial losses but the destruction of retirement security, family legacies, and fundamental trust in professional financial services for hundreds of victims. My own testimony had been scheduled for the final week of the prosecution's case, giving me time to observe the trial proceedings and prepare for what would be my first public accounting of Marcus's deception and its impact on both our marriage and his criminal activities. Agent Torres had worked with me extensively to prepare for cross-examination, helping me understand how Marcus's defense attorney would attempt to portray me as a willing beneficiary of criminal activity rather than an unwitting victim. The defense strategy would likely focus on my lifestyle during our marriage, suggesting that I'd known or suspected that Marcus's income was derived from illegal sources. "They're going to argue that you enjoyed the benefits of Marcus's crimes while remaining deliberately ignorant of their source," Agent Torres had explained during our preparation sessions. You need to be ready to describe specific examples of how Marcus concealed his activities from you and prevented you from gaining knowledge of his business operations. The preparation had been exhausting but necessary, forcing me to review 15 years of marriage through the lens of Marcus's systematic deception and identify specific instances where he'd lied to me, manipulated my perceptions, or prevented me from gaining accurate information about our financial situation. The pattern of control and manipulation had been more extensive than I'd initially realized, encompassing everything from our social activities, to our financial planning, to our discussions about future goals. Marcus had been a master manipulator who'd used my love and trust as weapons against me, and my testimony would expose those techniques to public scrutiny, while demonstrating how his domestic deception had been integral to his professional crimes. The woman who'd suggested marriage counseling 11 months earlier would finally have the opportunity to publicly describe the man she'd actually been married to, rather than the facade he'd presented to the world. Taking the witness stand had been one of the most difficult and empowering experiences of my life. The courtroom had been packed with victims, media representatives, and federal agents who'd worked to expose Marcus's criminal network. Marcus had sat at the defense table in his expensive suit, attempting to project confidence, while facing the testimony of the woman whose trust he'd systematically betrayed for 15 years. The prosecution had begun with basic questions about our marriage, our financial arrangements, and my understanding of Marcus's business activities. My responses had painted a picture of a woman who'd been deliberately excluded from her husband's professional life, while being used as a marketing tool to convince clients that he was trustworthy and stable. I had no knowledge of the offshore accounts, the shell companies, or the fraudulent investment schemes, I'd testified, looking directly at the jury rather than at Marcus. My husband told me that his business involved helping clients preserve and grow their wealth through conservative investment strategies. I believed him because I had no reason to suspect that the man I'd married and supported for 15 years was systematically stealing from elderly clients. The defense cross-examination had been aggressive but ineffective, with Marcus's attorney attempting to suggest that I'd been willfully ignorant of obvious signs that our lifestyle was supported by criminal activity. The strategy had backfired because Agent Torres had prepared me for exactly those questions, and my responses had demonstrated how Marcus's manipulation techniques had prevented me from recognizing the truth about his activities. Mr. Patterson controlled all business finances and excluded me from any involvement in professional decisions, I'd explained to the jury. When I asked questions about his work, he told me that financial services were too complicated for someone without professional training to understand. When I suggested attending business social events, he said they would be boring for me, and that I wouldn't have anything in common with his clients and colleagues. I wasn't willfully ignorant. I was systematically excluded and deliberately misled by someone I trusted completely. The defense had also attempted to suggest that my cooperation with federal investigators had been motivated by revenge rather than justice, implying that I was an angry ex-wife seeking to destroy Marcus through false testimony. Again, the strategy had been unsuccessful because the recorded conversations and financial evidence had corroborated every aspect of my testimony about Marcus's deception and criminal activities. I'm not testifying against Marcus because I'm angry about our divorce, I'd said during one particularly aggressive line of questioning. I'm testifying because he committed federal crimes that devastated hundreds of elderly victims, and because his systematic deception of me was an integral part of how he was able to gain their trust and steal their life savings. By the end of my testimony, the defense had accomplished nothing except highlighting the comprehensive nature of Marcus's deception and the devastating impact of his crimes on both his family and his clients. The jury had appeared engaged and sympathetic throughout my time on the witness stand, suggesting that my testimony had been effective in personalizing the consequences of Marcus's criminal activities. The trial had concluded 3 weeks later with guilty verdicts on all counts for Marcus and most of his co-conspirators. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 days before returning convictions for conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, securities fraud, and racketeering. The evidence had been so comprehensive that the defense's attempts to characterize legitimate business practices had been utterly unconvincing. Marcus's sentencing had been scheduled for 6 weeks after the conviction, giving the probation department time to prepare a comprehensive pre-sentence report that would include victim impact statements, financial loss calculations, and recommendations for restitution payments. The federal sentencing guidelines had suggested a prison term of 20 to 30 years, reflecting both the magnitude of the financial losses and the number of victims who'd been harmed by the criminal network. During the weeks between conviction and sentencing, I'd received letters from dozens of Marcus's victims, thanking me for having the courage to testify against him and expressing gratitude that justice was finally being served. The letters had been deeply moving, describing how Marcus's theft had impacted not just their financial security, but their ability to trust other people and institutions. "You gave us a voice when we felt powerless," one elderly client had written. "Your strength in court showed all of us that we didn't deserve what happened to us, and that the people who hurt us would be held accountable for their actions." The sentencing hearing had been the final chapter in Marcus's transformation from respected financial advisor to convicted felon, facing decades in federal prison. Judge Sandra Martinez had reviewed victim impact statements, financial loss calculations, and Marcus's lack of remorse before imposing a sentence that reflected the magnitude of his crimes and the number of lives he'd damaged through his systematic deception. "Mr. Patterson, you have betrayed the trust of hundreds of clients who relied on your professional expertise to protect their financial security," Judge Martinez had said, as Marcus stood to receive his sentence. "You have used your position of authority to steal from elderly and vulnerable investors, causing devastating losses that have affected not just their financial well-being, but their ability to trust other people and institutions. Your crimes represent a calculated and systematic betrayal of the most fundamental responsibilities of your profession." The sentence had been 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 12 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release and complete restitution to all identified victims. Marcus would be 71 years old before he could be considered for release, assuming he survived his incarceration and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation during his imprisonment. As Marcus had been led away in handcuffs, he'd looked at me one final time with an expression that had contained no remorse or acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused, only anger at being held accountable for his actions. Even facing decades in prison, Marcus had remained committed to his self-perception as someone who'd been unfairly persecuted, rather than appropriately punished for his crimes. The restitution payments had begun 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, funded through the liquidation of all assets he'd accumulated through criminal activity. The house, the business, the offshore accounts, the investment properties, everything had been sold to generate funds for victim compensation, with my share reflecting both my status as a defrauded spouse and my contributions to the facade of respectability that had enabled Marcus's crimes. The final settlement had exceeded $3 million, providing me with financial security for the rest of my life, while ensuring that Marcus's other victims received substantial compensation for their losses. More importantly, the federal prosecution had exposed the entire criminal network and prevented them from continuing to harm additional victims. Agent Torres had remained in contact throughout the restitution process, providing updates on the ongoing investigation into similar fraud networks, and expressing gratitude for my cooperation in bringing Marcus and his accomplices to justice. "Your willingness to fight back against Marcus's manipulation literally saved lives," Agent Torres had said during our final meeting. "The evidence you helped us gather prevented this network from continuing to operate, and your testimony gave other victims the courage to come forward with information about similar crimes in other jurisdictions." Looking back on the 18 months that had transformed me from a trusting wife to a federal witness who'd helped expose a major criminal network, I'd realized that Marcus had been right about one thing. Marriage counseling would have been pointless for us, not because our problems were unsolvable, but because one of us had been a criminal who'd been using our marriage to facilitate systematic fraud against vulnerable victims. But divorce court had been extraordinarily productive, revealing not just Marcus's financial deception, but his entire criminal enterprise, ensuring justice for hundreds of victims, and teaching me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be complicit in someone else's lies, even when those lies have been the foundation of everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and partnership. The quiet life I'd built in Boulder after Marcus's conviction had been infinitely more honest and fulfilling than the elaborate deception I'd unknowingly participated in during our marriage. My graphic design business had grown substantially, fueled by clients who appreciated working with someone who understood the importance of integrity and transparency in professional relationships. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about people and situations, recognizing that the red flags I'd dismissed in Marcus's behavior had been accurate warnings that I'd been trained to ignore through years of systematic manipulation. The woman who'd suggested marriage counseling had been trying to save a relationship that had never been real in the first place. The woman who'd testified in federal court had been protecting herself and others from a criminal who'd used the facade of domestic respectability to facilitate systematic harm against innocent people. Marcus had spent years telling me that I was too trusting, too naive, too financially unsophisticated to understand complex business matters. The federal prosecution had proven that I was actually intelligent enough to recognize criminal behavior when I finally had access to accurate information, strong enough to fight back against systematic manipulation, and brave enough to testify against someone who'd betrayed my trust in the most fundamental ways possible. Sometimes the end of a marriage isn't a failure of love or commitment. Sometimes it's the beginning of justice, the first step toward exposing systematic harm and protecting other potential victims from someone who's been hiding behind the facade of respectability while causing devastating damage to vulnerable people. Marriage counseling might have been pointless, but divorce court had been the most productive and important experience of my life, transforming me from Marcus's unknowing accomplice into the agent of his destruction and the protector of his future victims. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 18 months after Marcus's conviction, delivered to my Boulder home by a federal courier who required my signature and identification before handing over the thick manila envelope marked with Department of Justice seals. Inside was a notification that had taken me completely by surprise, despite everything I'd learned about the scope of Marcus's criminal activities. Mrs. Patterson, the letter had begun in formal government language. Recent investigations have identified additional criminal activities connected to your former husband's fraud network that may have directly impacted you during your marriage. Agent Torres requests your presence at a meeting scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. to discuss new evidence that has emerged regarding financial crimes that predate the charges for which Mr. Patterson was convicted. Additional criminal activities that predated his conviction. I thought we'd uncovered everything during the federal investigation, that every secret account and fraudulent scheme had been exposed during the comprehensive discovery process that had led to Marcus's 25-year prison sentence. Apparently, I'd been wrong. The meeting took place in the same federal building where I'd first been briefed about Marcus's fraud network, but this time Agent Torres was accompanied by Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Cold Case Division, whose presence immediately signaled that whatever new evidence they'd discovered involved crimes that were significantly older than we'd previously understood. Mrs. Patterson, Agent Walsh had begun after the standard pleasantries. We've been investigating suspicious death benefits and insurance payouts connected to your husband's associates, and we've discovered a pattern that suggests the fraud network was involved in activities far more serious than financial theft. Suspicious death benefits. The phrase had sent a chill through me as I'd considered the implications of what Agent Walsh might be suggesting. During our marriage, Marcus had occasionally mentioned clients who'd died unexpectedly, usually elderly investors, whose deaths had resulted in insurance payouts or estate transfers that had seemed tragic but unremarkable at the time. We've identified 7 cases over the past 8 years where elderly clients of network members died, under circumstances that appeared natural but occurred at financially convenient times. For the advisors managing their investments, Agent Walsh had continued, spreading photographs across the conference table that showed elderly faces I didn't recognize. In each case, the client had recently made significant changes to their investment strategies or estate planning, at the recommendation of their financial advisor. 7 suspicious deaths. I'd stared at the photographs, trying to process the possibility that Marcus and his associates had been involved in something far more sinister than financial fraud. The elderly faces looking back at me from the photographs had been people who'd trusted their financial advisors with their life savings, never imagining that those same advisors might have been planning their deaths to access insurance payouts and estate assets. The pattern only became visible when we started examining cases across multiple jurisdictions, Agent Torres had explained. Individual deaths appeared to be natural causes, heart attacks, strokes, accidental falls. But when we analyzed them collectively, the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Agent Walsh had opened a thick file containing medical records, insurance documents, and financial transactions that painted a disturbing picture of systematic murder disguised as natural death. The network members had apparently been identifying elderly clients with substantial life insurance policies and minimal family oversight, then manipulating their medical care to ensure fatal outcomes that would trigger insurance payouts under the advisor's control. The methods were sophisticated and difficult to detect, Agent Walsh had continued. Medication interactions that would cause heart failure in elderly patients with existing conditions. Medical equipment malfunctions during routine procedures. Even simple things like ensuring that clients with balance problems were encouraged to take unnecessary risks that could result in fatal falls. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the elderly woman who testified so powerfully about Marcus's financial fraud, had apparently been targeted for murder as well as theft. Her name was on a list Agent Torres had recovered from Victoria Chen's apartment, along with detailed information about her medical conditions, insurance policies, and family situation that would have made her an ideal victim for the network's murder scheme. Only her decision to move in with her daughter after losing her savings had protected her from becoming the network's next victim, Agent Torres had explained. The list indicates that Marcus was planning to recommend a change in her living situation that would have isolated her from family supervision and made her more vulnerable to medical manipulation. The revelation that Marcus had been planning to murder Mrs. Walsh after stealing her life savings had been almost impossible to process. I'd watched her testify during his trial, describing how his financial fraud had devastated her retirement security, never knowing that she'd also narrowly escaped becoming his murder victim. But the most shocking discovery had been the evidence suggesting that Marcus's criminal activities had begun much earlier than anyone had realized, possibly extending back to the death of his first wife, Jennifer, whom I'd been told had died in a tragic accident 3 years before we'd met. We've obtained Jennifer Patterson's medical records and insurance files, Agent Walsh had said. Consulting notes that I could see contained Jennifer's photograph and detailed biographical information. Her death was originally ruled accidental, but our analysis suggests she may have been the first victim of the murder scheme that Marcus later expanded through his fraud network. Jennifer's death. I'd rarely thought about Marcus's first wife during our marriage, accepting his explanation that she'd died in a fall down the stairs at their home while he'd been away on a business trip. He'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken when he'd occasionally mentioned her, describing their relationship as deeply loving but tragically cut short by an unexpected accident. Now I understood that Jennifer's death had probably been Marcus's first successful murder, the crime that had taught him how to kill vulnerable victims while maintaining the appearance of tragic accidents. The insurance payout from Jennifer's death had funded his courtship of me, making me literally a replacement purchased with blood money from his first wife's murder. The financial records we've recovered suggest that Marcus received approximately $400,000 from Jennifer's life insurance policy, Agent Torres had explained. That money was transferred to offshore accounts and used to establish the business relationships that became the foundation for his fraud network. Jennifer's death wasn't just personal crime. It was the seed money for everything that followed. $400,000. The amount Marcus had invested in establishing Patterson Financial Consulting, money I'd assumed had come from business loans or investor partnerships. Instead, it had been blood money from the murder of the woman whose place I'd unknowingly taken in Marcus's life. Agent Walsh had shown me photographs of Jennifer's home, focusing on the staircase where she'd allegedly fallen to her death. The scene had been carefully staged to look like an accident, but forensic experts had identified inconsistencies that suggested Jennifer had been pushed or deliberately caused a fall during a struggle with her attacker. The original investigation was perfunctory because Marcus had an alibi and there was no obvious motive for murder, Agent Walsh had explained. Local police treated it as a tragic accident and didn't perform the kind of detailed forensic analysis that might have revealed evidence of foul play. But advances in forensic science had made it possible to re-examine Jennifer's death using techniques that hadn't been available 8 years earlier. Hair and fiber evidence from the scene had been preserved, and DNA analysis had revealed traces of Marcus's presence at locations where he'd claimed never to have been on the day of Jennifer's death. "We have enough evidence to charge Marcus with Jennifer's murder," Agent Torres had said, her tone indicating that this was a significant development rather than simply academic interest in cold case resolution. "The federal prosecutors are prepared to file additional charges that could result in a life sentence without possibility of parole. A life sentence without possibility of parole." Marcus was already facing 25 years for financial fraud, but murder charges would ensure that he never had any possibility of release from federal prison. The man who dismissed marriage counseling as pointless would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, contemplating the consequences of his systematic betrayal of everyone who'd ever trusted him. But the implications for me were more complex than simple satisfaction at Marcus receiving appropriate punishment for his crimes. If Jennifer had been murdered for insurance money, and if I'd been unknowingly purchased as her replacement using that same blood money, then my entire relationship with Marcus had been built on a foundation even more sinister than I'd previously understood. Agent Walsh had anticipated my concerns about my own safety during my marriage to Marcus. "Based on our analysis of the network's methods, you were never in immediate physical danger," she'd assured me. "Marcus's strategy with you was long-term financial manipulation rather than murder. Probably because your income and assets weren't sufficient to justify the risks associated with killing you. Not sufficient to justify the risks associated with killing me." The clinical assessment of my financial value versus my murder risk had been both reassuring and oddly insulting. Marcus had apparently calculated that I was more valuable to him alive as a facade of respectability than dead as an insurance payout, a determination that had probably saved my life without my ever knowing I'd been in danger. The meeting had concluded with Agent Torres explaining that federal prosecutors would be filing additional charges against Marcus and requesting my cooperation as a witness in the murder case, just as I'd testified in the fraud prosecution. The evidence against Marcus was strong enough to proceed without my testimony, but my perspective as his second wife would help establish the pattern of manipulation and deception that had characterized his relationships with both Jennifer and me. "You represent continuity in Marcus's criminal evolution," Agent Torres had explained. "Your testimony will help the jury understand how he used marriage as a tool for criminal activity, and how his murder of Jennifer was connected to the broader pattern of exploitation that defined his fraud network." Driving home from the federal building, I'd tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned about Marcus's criminal history and the true nature of our relationship. I'd spent 15 years married to a man who'd murdered his first wife, stolen millions of dollars from elderly clients, and planned the deaths of vulnerable victims who trusted him with their financial security. But more disturbing than the scope of Marcus's crimes was the realization that I'd been selected as Jennifer's replacement, specifically because Marcus had calculated that I would be useful for his criminal activities, while being too trusting and financially naive to recognize his true nature. Every aspect of our relationship, from our first meeting through our wedding day to our daily interactions, had been carefully orchestrated by someone who'd viewed me as a useful asset rather than a beloved partner. The federal prosecutors had been correct about my safety during the marriage, but only because Marcus had needed me alive to maintain his facade of respectability. If my financial situation had been different, if I'd had larger life insurance policies or more valuable assets, I might have become another victim of his murder scheme, rather than simply another target of his manipulation and deception. That evening, I'd called my sister Amanda to tell her about the new revelations regarding Marcus's criminal activities, and the possibility that I'd unknowingly been married to a murderer for 15 years. Amanda's reaction had been immediate and characteristically protective. "Rebecca, you need to understand that none of this is your fault," Amanda had said, her voice carrying the fierce loyalty that had defined our relationship since childhood. "Marcus was a predator who specialized in targeting trusting women. The fact that you didn't recognize his true nature doesn't mean you were stupid or careless. It means he was skillful at deception and manipulation. But I had recognized warning signs, hadn't I? The secretiveness about his business activities, the gradual erosion of intimacy in our relationship, the way he'd become increasingly critical of aspects of my personality and lifestyle that had never bothered him before. I'd attributed those changes to normal marital evolution, rather than evidence that I was living with someone who was systematically planning criminal activities that required emotional distance from potential witnesses. The preparation for Marcus's murder trial had been more intensive than my involvement in the fraud prosecution, partly because the evidence was more complex, and partly because federal prosecutors wanted to ensure that Marcus received the maximum possible sentence for his crimes. Agent Walsh had worked with me extensively to review Jennifer's case file and understand how her murder had been connected to Marcus's later criminal activities. Jennifer Patterson had been 34 years old when she died, just 2 years older than I'd been when Marcus and I had married. She'd been an elementary school teacher with a modest income and simple lifestyle, someone who'd trusted her husband completely and had no reason to suspect that he was planning her death for financial gain. The parallels between Jennifer's life and mine had been disturbing but illuminating. We'd both been selected by Marcus because we were financially independent but not wealthy, professionally stable but not ambitious, trusting but not suspicious. We'd both provided him with the appearance of domestic stability that had been crucial for his professional success, and we'd both been systematically excluded from any real knowledge of his business activities. The primary difference between Jennifer and me had been timing. Jennifer had died before Marcus had developed the sophisticated fraud network that had made financial theft more profitable than murder. By the time Marcus had married me, he discovered that stealing from clients was less risky and more lucrative than killing wives for insurance money, so I'd been more valuable to him alive than dead. Agent Walsh had showed me crime scene photographs from Jennifer's death that had been difficult to view but necessary for understanding how Marcus's criminal methods had evolved over time. The staging of Jennifer's accident had been less sophisticated than the network's later murder schemes, suggesting that Marcus had learned from experience and improved his techniques as he'd gained confidence and criminal expertise. The forensic evidence that would convict Marcus of Jennifer's murder had been collected 8 years earlier, but hadn't been properly analyzed until federal investigators had recognized the connection between her death and the broader pattern of crimes committed by his fraud network. Advances in DNA analysis and crime scene reconstruction had made it possible to prove that Jennifer's death had been murder rather than accident, despite Marcus's careful planning and staging of the scene. But the most damning evidence against Marcus had come from an unexpected source: his own documentation of Jennifer's murder. Federal agents had discovered an encrypted computer file containing detailed notes about Jennifer's daily routines, medical conditions, insurance policies, and the planned method for causing her death while maintaining the appearance of an accident. Marcus had apparently kept records of his first murder as reference material for potential future crimes, documenting what had worked well and what could be improved if he decided to kill again. The file had also contained preliminary notes about several of his later fraud victims, suggesting that he'd initially considered murdering them before deciding that financial theft was more profitable and less risky than homicide. The encrypted file had been recovered from a computer storage device hidden in Marcus's office, apparently forgotten during the chaos of his arrest for fraud charges. Federal computer specialists had spent months breaking the encryption and analyzing the contents, which had provided prosecutors with detailed evidence of premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit additional murders. The murder trial had been scheduled for March, nearly 2 years after Marcus's conviction for financial fraud, and 3 years after I'd first suggested marriage counseling as a solution to our relationship problems. The Denver media had covered the case extensively, describing it as one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in Colorado history, and highlighting the sophisticated methods Marcus had used to avoid detection for his crimes. Public interest in the case had been intense, partly because of the financial fraud's impact on elderly victims, and partly because of the revelation that a respected financial advisor had been operating as a serial killer while maintaining the facade of a stable marriage and successful business. The contrast between Marcus's public image and his criminal reality had fascinated media representatives and legal observers who'd followed the prosecution. I'd testified on the 4th day of the murder trial, describing my relationship with Marcus and how his manipulation techniques had prevented me from recognizing his criminal activities or understanding the true nature of his character. The prosecution had used my testimony to establish Marcus's pattern of using romantic relationships to facilitate criminal activities while maintaining emotional distance from his victims. Marcus showed me the same superficial charm and attention that he used with his fraud victims, I'd explained to the jury. trying to help them understand how skilled manipulators operated. He made me feel special and valued while systematically excluding me from any real knowledge of his thoughts, feelings, or activities. I thought I knew him intimately, but I actually knew almost nothing about the person I'd been married to for 15 years. The defense had attempted to suggest that I was exaggerating Marcus's deceptive abilities in order to justify my failure to recognize obvious signs that he was a criminal. But the strategy had been unsuccessful because the evidence of his sophisticated manipulation was so comprehensive. Recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from other victims had all corroborated my description of Marcus as someone who specialized in gaining trust while concealing his true nature. The prosecution had also presented testimony from Dr. Sarah Morrison, a forensic psychologist who'd analyzed Marcus's criminal behavior and concluded that he displayed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Morrison's analysis had provided the jury with a clinical framework for understanding how Marcus had been able to maintain multiple deceptive relationships while committing serious crimes without apparent emotional distress. Mr. Patterson demonstrates a complete lack of empathy for his victims and an inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people, Dr. Morrison had testified. His relationships with his wives, his clients, and his business associates were all instrumental rather than emotional. He viewed other people as tools to be used for his own benefit, rather than as individuals worthy of respect and consideration. The clinical description of Marcus's psychological profile had been both illuminating and disturbing, explaining behaviors I'd observed during our marriage but had attributed to stress, personality differences, or normal relationship evolution. Marcus's inability to form genuine emotional connections hadn't been a temporary condition caused by work pressure or life circumstances. It had been a fundamental aspect of his character that had made him capable of systematic deception and violence against people who'd trusted him completely. Victoria Chen had also testified in the murder trial, describing conversations where Marcus had discussed his first wife's death in ways that had seemed suspicious at the time, but that Victoria had dismissed as grief-related emotional difficulties. Her testimony had provided evidence that Marcus had revealed details about Jennifer's death that weren't consistent with his official statements to police investigators. Marcus told me that Jennifer had been acting strangely before her death, asking questions about their finances and expressing concerns about his business activities, Victoria had said during her examination. He described her death as unfortunate timing, because they'd been having marital difficulties, and her questions had been causing stress in their relationship. Marital difficulties caused by Jennifer's questions about Marcus's business activities. The parallel to my own experience had been obvious and chilling. Marcus had apparently developed a pattern of becoming irritated when his wives showed interest in his professional life or asked for detailed explanations about financial matters. Jennifer's curiosity about his business activities had probably been one of the factors that had led Marcus to decide she was more valuable to him dead than alive. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering related to the broader criminal network. Marcus had shown no visible reaction to the verdict, maintaining the same emotional detachment that had characterized his behavior throughout both trials. Judge Martinez had scheduled Marcus's sentencing for the murder conviction to take place immediately after the jury's verdict, consolidating it with a review of his existing sentence for the fraud charges. The combined penalties would ensure that Marcus spent the rest of his life in federal prison without any possibility of parole or early release. Mr. Patterson, you have demonstrated a complete disregard for human life and dignity through your systematic criminal activities, Judge Martinez had said as Marcus stood to receive his sentence. You murdered your first wife for financial gain, defrauded hundreds of elderly clients of their life savings, and planned additional murders to further your criminal enterprise. Your crimes represent a level of calculated cruelty that warrants the maximum penalty available under federal law. The sentence had been life in prison without possibility of parole, to be served consecutively with his existing 25-year sentence for financial fraud. Marcus would die in federal prison, having spent the final decades of his life in solitary confinement as protection against other inmates who might target him for his crimes against elderly victims. As Marcus had been led away in handcuffs for the final time, I'd felt not satisfaction but a profound sense of relief that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people who'd trusted him with their financial security or personal safety. The man who'd dismissed marriage counseling as pointless had ultimately received the most thorough counseling available, a lifetime of incarceration to contemplate the consequences of his systematic betrayal of everyone who'd ever loved or trusted him. The media coverage following Marcus's conviction had been extensive, with financial publications analyzing the case as an example of how sophisticated criminals could exploit the trust and vulnerability of elderly clients, while maintaining facades of professional respectability. The Denver Post had published a series of articles examining the broader implications of financial fraud networks, and the inadequate regulatory oversight that had allowed Marcus's crimes to continue undetected for years. But the most meaningful coverage had been a letter published in the Rocky Mountain News from Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, thanking me for having the courage to testify against Marcus, and explaining how the prosecution had provided closure for victims who'd feared that their suffering would never be acknowledged, or their losses would never be recovered. Mrs. Patterson's bravery in exposing her husband's crimes gave all of us the strength to believe that justice was possible, Mrs. Walsh had written. She could have accepted a quiet settlement and disappeared from public view, but instead she chose to fight for truth and accountability. Her courage saved lives and protected other potential victims from the man who had already caused so much harm. Reading Mrs. Walsh's letter, I'd understood that my decision to pursue complete financial disclosure during our divorce proceedings had been about more than securing fair compensation for my contributions to Marcus's apparent success. It had been about refusing to be complicit in a system that allowed criminals to exploit the trust and vulnerability of innocent people, while hiding behind facades of domestic respectability and professional achievement. The restitution payments from Marcus's conviction had continued for months after his sentencing, funded through the ongoing liquidation of assets he'd accumulated through criminal activities. The final settlement had exceeded $4 million, reflecting not just my share of marital assets, but compensation for my unwitting participation in providing credibility for Marcus's criminal enterprise. More importantly, the prosecution had established legal precedents that would make it easier for future victims of similar crimes to recover their losses, and for law enforcement agencies to coordinate investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The Marcus Patterson case had become a model for how to investigate and prosecute sophisticated financial fraud networks that used personal relationships to facilitate criminal activities. Agent Torres had remained in contact throughout the restitution process, providing updates on related investigations and expressing continued gratitude for my cooperation in exposing Marcus's criminal network. The evidence I'd helped gather had been used to identify and prosecute similar fraud schemes in other states, ultimately protecting hundreds of potential victims from financial theft and possible murder. Your willingness to seek truth instead of accepting convenient lies probably saved more lives than we'll ever be able to calculate, Agent Torres had said during our final meeting. Marcus's network was expanding rapidly, and there's no telling how many elderly clients might have been murdered if you hadn't been brave enough to fight for complete financial disclosure during your divorce proceedings. The irony hadn't been lost on me that my suggestion of marriage counseling, which Marcus had dismissed as pointless, had ultimately led to the complete exposure of his criminal activities and the protection of countless potential victims. If Marcus had been willing to work on our relationship through honest communication and professional guidance, I might never have discovered the fraud that had led to uncovering his murder schemes. Instead, his arrogant assumption that he could manipulate and control me indefinitely had led him to underestimate my intelligence, my determination, and my commitment to protecting innocent people from systematic harm. The woman he'd married as a convenient facade for criminal activity had become the primary agent of his destruction and the protector of his intended victims. Life in Boulder had settled into a peaceful routine that was infinitely more honest and fulfilling than the elaborate deception I'd unknowingly participated in during my marriage to Marcus. My graphic design business had grown substantially, attracting clients who appreciated working with someone who understood the importance of integrity and transparency in professional relationships. I'd also become involved with victim advocacy organizations, providing support and guidance to other people who discovered that their trusted partners had been systematically deceiving them about criminal activities. The experience of exposing Marcus's crimes had taught me valuable skills for recognizing manipulation techniques and building cases against sophisticated criminals who used personal relationships to facilitate their illegal activities. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment about people and situations, recognizing that the warning signs I'd dismissed during my marriage had been accurate assessments that I'd been trained to ignore through years of systematic gaslighting and emotional manipulation. The woman who'd suggested marriage counseling had been trying to save a relationship that had never been genuine in the first place. The woman who testified in federal court had been protecting herself and others from a predator who'd used the facade of domestic respectability to facilitate systematic harm against vulnerable people. The house I'd purchased in Boulder was smaller than the suburban home I'd shared with Marcus, but it was entirely mine, furnished according to my actual preferences, rather than someone else's image management needs. The walls were decorated with artwork I'd chosen because I loved it, not because it projected the right impression to business associates and potential victims. My social circle had expanded to include people who appreciated honesty and authenticity rather than professional success and financial achievement. The friends I'd made in Boulder were genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than calculated networking opportunities designed to facilitate criminal activities. 6 months after Marcus's final conviction, I'd received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Patterson's sister Lisa, who'd been following the murder prosecution and wanted to thank me for providing the testimony that had finally brought justice for Jennifer's death. I never believed that Jennifer's death was an accident, Lisa had said, her voice carrying years of frustration and grief. But the police investigation was so cursory, and Marcus seemed so devastated by her loss, that I couldn't prove my suspicions. Your courage in exposing his later crimes gave Jennifer the justice she deserved, and gave our family the closure we needed. Jennifer's family had established a foundation to support victims of domestic violence and financial fraud, using the restitution money from Marcus's conviction to fund legal advocacy and support services for people trying to escape abusive relationships. They'd asked me to serve on the board of directors, recognizing that my experience with Marcus's manipulation techniques could help other victims recognize and respond to similar patterns of deception. Working with Jennifer's foundation had provided me with a sense of purpose that went beyond personal recovery and financial security. Every case we handled, every victim we helped, every criminal we exposed was a continuation of the work that had begun when I'd refused to accept Marcus's incomplete financial disclosure during our divorce proceedings. The foundation had handled dozens of cases involving sophisticated financial fraud and domestic manipulation, often working with federal investigators to identify and prosecute criminal networks similar to the one Marcus had operated. The patterns were remarkably consistent. Charming, successful men who used romantic relationships to gain access to victims' financial resources while maintaining facades of respectability that made their crimes difficult to detect. But we'd also identified warning signs that could help potential victims recognize dangerous situations before they became trapped in relationships with criminals who specialized in exploitation and manipulation. Financial secrecy, emotional isolation, gradual erosion of personal autonomy, and systematic discouragement of outside relationships were all indicators that someone might be involved with a predator rather than a genuine partner. The most rewarding aspect of the Foundation's work had been providing support to victims who discovered that their trusted partners had been systematically deceiving them about criminal activities. The shame, confusion, and self-doubt that accompanied those discoveries were emotions I understood intimately, and my experience with Marcus's prosecution had taught me how to navigate the legal and emotional challenges of exposing sophisticated criminals. One case had been particularly meaningful to me, a woman named Sarah Martinez, whose husband had been operating investment fraud schemes similar to Marcus's network, while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage and successful business career. Sarah had discovered her husband's crimes when she'd found encrypted files on his computer, but she'd been afraid to report him because she'd feared being charged as an accomplice to his criminal activities. I convinced Sarah to contact federal investigators and provided her with legal advocacy throughout the prosecution process. Her husband's fraud network had been smaller than Marcus's operation, but the methods had been virtually identical, targeting elderly clients, using marriage as a marketing tool for credibility, and systematically stealing retirement savings while reporting fictional investment returns. Sarah's testimony had been crucial to securing her husband's conviction and recovering stolen assets for victim restitution. More importantly, her courage in exposing his crimes had prevented the network from expanding and claiming additional victims who might never have recovered their losses. Cases like Sarah's had reinforced my understanding that the decision to seek truth, instead of accepting convenient lies, could have consequences far beyond personal satisfaction or financial recovery. Every criminal we exposed, every network we dismantled, every victim we protected was a victory for honesty and justice over manipulation and exploitation. The Denver media had continued to follow developments in cases related to Marcus's criminal network, often contacting me for comment on new prosecutions or policy changes designed to prevent similar crimes. I'd been careful to maintain my privacy while supporting efforts to educate the public about the warning signs of financial fraud and domestic manipulation. One interview had been particularly important, a documentary about sophisticated financial fraud that had aired on a national news program, highlighting the Marcus Patterson case as an example of how criminals could exploit regulatory gaps and victim trust to operate illegal enterprises for years without detection. The documentary had reached millions of viewers, potentially protecting countless people from becoming victims of similar crimes. Looking back on the 4 years that had transformed me from a trusting wife to a federal witness who'd helped expose multiple criminal networks, I'd realized that Marcus had been correct about one thing. Marriage counseling would have been pointless for us. Our problems hadn't been communication issues or relationship dynamics that could be resolved through professional guidance and mutual effort. Our problems had been that one of us was a serial killer and sophisticated criminal who'd been using our marriage as cover for systematic fraud and murder, while the other had been an honest person trying to save a relationship that had never been genuine in the first place. No amount of counseling could have bridged that fundamental gap between criminal and victim, predator and prey. But divorce court had been extraordinarily productive, revealing not just Marcus's financial deception, but his entire criminal enterprise, ensuring justice for multiple murder and fraud victims, and establishing legal precedents that would protect future victims from similar crimes. Sometimes the end of a marriage isn't a personal failure. Sometimes it's the beginning of justice and the first step toward protecting innocent people from systematic harm. The quiet evening routine I'd established in my Boulder home often included reviewing foundation cases and preparing testimony for ongoing prosecutions related to financial fraud networks. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful, providing me with the opportunity to transform my experience as Marcus's victim into protection for other people who might otherwise fall prey to similar criminals. My graphic design business had also evolved to include pro bono work for victim advocacy organizations and nonprofit groups working to expose financial fraud and domestic violence. The skills I'd developed during my marriage to Marcus, attention to detail, pattern recognition, professional presentation, had proven valuable for creating materials that could help potential victims recognize dangerous situations and seek appropriate help. Most evenings, I'd sit in my living room with a cup of tea and the case files spread across my coffee table, working on presentations or legal documents while classical music played softly in the background. The contrast with my life during my marriage to Marcus couldn't have been more complete. Instead of waiting for a husband who was probably planning criminal activities during his supposed business meetings, I was actively working to protect other people from experiencing similar betrayal and exploitation. The phone call that would mark the final chapter in my relationship with Marcus's criminal legacy came on a cold December evening, nearly 4 years after I'd first suggested marriage counseling as a solution to our marital problems. Agent Torres was calling to inform me that Marcus had died in federal prison, apparently from a heart attack suffered during his sleep. Marcus Patterson died at 3:47 a.m. at the Federal Correctional Institution in Florence, Colorado, Agent Torres had said, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. The death appears to be from natural causes, though there will be an investigation as required by federal protocol for all inmate deaths. Marcus was dead at 54 years old, having spent his final 3 years in solitary confinement for his protection against other inmates who might have targeted him for his crimes against elderly victims. He died alone in a concrete cell, surrounded by the consequences of his systematic betrayal of everyone who'd ever trusted him, with their financial security, personal safety, or genuine love. I'd felt neither satisfaction nor grief at the news of Marcus's death, only a sense of closure that his ability to harm innocent people had finally ended permanently, rather than being temporarily suspended by imprisonment. The man who'd dismissed marriage counseling as pointless had ultimately received the most thorough possible education about the consequences of systematic deception and manipulation. Complete social isolation followed by death alone in federal prison. Agent Torres had also informed me that Marcus's death would not affect the ongoing restitution payments to his victims or the continued investigation of similar criminal networks that might be operating in other jurisdictions. The precedents established by his prosecution would continue to protect potential victims and provide legal tools for exposing sophisticated criminals who used personal relationships to facilitate their illegal activities. The foundation work would continue as well, providing support and advocacy for victims of financial fraud and domestic manipulation, while educating the public about warning signs that could help people avoid becoming trapped in relationships with predators who specialized in exploitation and control. Marcus's death had closed the final chapter in a story that had begun with my naive suggestion that we try marriage counseling to save our relationship. That suggestion had ultimately led to exposing multiple criminal networks, securing justice for hundreds of victims, establishing important legal precedents, and protecting countless potential victims from systematic harm. Marriage counseling had indeed been pointless for Marcus and me, but not because our problems were too complex or our differences were irreconcilable. It had been pointless because one of us had been a criminal who'd been incapable of genuine honesty or emotional connection, while the other had been trying to save something that had never existed in the first place. Divorce court, however, had been the most productive experience of my life, transforming me from Marcus's unknowing accomplice into the primary agent of his destruction and the protector of his intended victims. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop trying to save something that was never worth saving, and start building something new that's based on truth rather than elaborate deception. The evening news that night had included a brief report about Marcus's death, describing him as a convicted murderer and financial fraud mastermind who'd been serving multiple life sentences for crimes that had devastated hundreds of elderly victims throughout the western United States. The report had also mentioned the Victim Advocacy Foundation established in Jennifer Patterson's memory, acknowledging the ongoing work to protect other people from similar crimes. Watching the news report, I'd understood that Marcus's legacy would be defined not by his temporary criminal success, but by the justice system's response to his crimes, and the protective measures that had been implemented to prevent similar harm to future victims. The man who'd thought he was too clever to be caught and too charming to be held accountable had ultimately become a case study in how sophisticated criminals could be exposed and prosecuted when their victims found the courage to seek truth instead of accepting convenient lies. The quiet house around me represented everything Marcus had tried to prevent me from having: independence, honesty, genuine relationships, meaningful work, and the security that comes from building a life based on truth rather than deception. In death, as in life, Marcus had underestimated the strength and intelligence of the woman he'd dismissed as too trusting and financially naive to cause him problems. Marriage counseling might have been pointless, but divorce court had been extraordinarily productive, leading to justice, truth, protection for innocent people, and ultimately the kind of personal growth and social contribution that Marcus had never been capable of understanding or achieving. Sometimes the end of one story really is the beginning of a much better one, built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and an unshakable commitment to honesty in all its forms. The Foundation's annual report arrived on a spring morning 5 years later, thick with success stories and statistics that would have seemed impossible when I'd first discovered Marcus's deception. We'd helped recover over $30 million for fraud victims, assisted in prosecuting 47 criminals, and provided legal advocacy for hundreds of families who discovered their trusted partners were actually sophisticated predators. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh had passed away peacefully the previous winter, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that her testimony had helped protect countless other elderly investors from similar crimes. Her daughter had continued supporting the Foundation's work, ensuring that her mother's courage in exposing Marcus's network would have lasting impact beyond her own lifetime. The small frame on my office desk held a photograph from the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration, showing dozens of survivors and advocates who'd transformed their experiences with criminal deception into protection for future victims. Each face represented someone who'd chosen truth over convenient lies, justice over personal comfort, and courage over complicity. My graphic design work had evolved into creating educational materials about financial fraud and domestic manipulation, resources that were distributed through law enforcement agencies, victim services organizations, and community groups throughout the country. The skills Marcus had dismissed as insufficiently ambitious had become weapons against criminals who used charm and manipulation to exploit vulnerable people. The quiet life I'd built in Boulder was everything Marcus had tried to prevent me from achieving. Independence based on honest work rather than criminal profits. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than calculated manipulation. Security that came from integrity rather than deception. Peace that emerged from truth rather than elaborate lies. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened if Marcus had been willing to try marriage counseling, to honestly examine his behavior and motivations, to consider building something genuine rather than exploiting everything around him. But those thoughts never lasted long, because Marcus had been fundamentally incapable of the honesty and empathy that real relationships required. The marriage counseling he'd dismissed as pointless couldn't have saved us because there had never been an actual us to save. There had only been Marcus's carefully constructed facade and my unwitting participation in maintaining that deception. Real counseling would have required him to acknowledge his criminal activities, his systematic manipulation, his complete inability to form genuine human connections. Divorce court had been productive beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd first walked into Janet's office, seeking legal representation for what I'd assumed would be a straightforward asset division. Instead, it had become the beginning of justice for hundreds of victims, the dismantling of multiple criminal networks, and the establishment of legal precedents that would continue protecting innocent people long after Marcus's death. The woman who'd suggested marriage counseling had been naive about the true nature of her husband and the relationship she'd been trying to save. The woman who'd testified in federal court had been informed, determined, and absolutely committed to ensuring that Marcus's victims received justice and that his criminal networks could never harm anyone else. Marcus had been wrong about many things, but he'd been catastrophically wrong about me. The trusting wife he'd selected as a convenient facade had become the primary architect of his destruction, the protector of his intended victims, and the voice that had exposed his crimes to the world. His dismissal of marriage counseling as pointless had led directly to divorce court proceedings that had been the most productive and meaningful experience of my life. Evening sunlight streamed through my Boulder home's windows as I finished reviewing the Foundation's latest case files, each one representing another victory against criminals who used personal relationships to facilitate systematic harm. The quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, honest relationships, and genuine security was everything Marcus had never understood, and everything he'd inadvertently given me by underestimating my strength and determination. Marriage counseling might have been pointless for us, but divorce court had changed everything, transforming personal betrayal into public justice and private pain into protection for countless innocent people. Sometimes the end of one story really is the beginning of something much more important and valuable than what came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.